Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa, during his State of the Nation address last night, said overarching legislation for state-owned enterprises will be tabled in Cabinet this financial year and in Parliament in the next financial year. A centralized state-owned entity model is also being implemented this financial year, which will ensure standardized governance, financial management, and an operational performance framework for all SOEs. The president said the mandate of all SOEs is also being re-evaluated to ensure that they were responsive to the country's needs as well as the implementation of the National Development Plan. Joining us to discuss this further is our guest, Mr. Ivor Sarakinsky. And very good afternoon, or rather good evening to you, sir. And thank you so much for your time today. Now, when the president talks of a centralized SOE model, what is that likely to look like, and what is it really aimed to achieve?
Well, it's a great question because the president formed a special advisory council in June last year, and it was announced officially in terms of the membership in November. That gives them about 2 months to come up with proposals. So it's difficult to establish what the mechanisms of this coordinating body are going to be in terms of managing the SOEs. So if I'm to speculate on what that's about, perhaps they're following the Chinese model here. And the Chinese model is interesting because it's marketizing SOEs, privatizing those that don't add value, making them profit-driven and making them independent on government in terms of independent boards. So if that's the kind of thinking that is informing this new coordinating body, then there are a number of positives in it, ironically from China.
What you've described now, how does that differ from privatization?
It means that the entity is, all the shares in the entity are owned by the state. So it's not a private enterprise initiative. It just means that the incentives in terms of managing performance of the SOE change, and you get back to the principles of market discipline. So you can't see SOEs as a cash cow to fund all kinds of pet and luxury projects, never mind corruption and stealing resources from SOEs, because you've got to balance the budget, you've got to balance the books, and you subject yourself to market discipline. And that means that you allow competition. It might mean that PRASA might have to compete with private sector rail service providers, for example, in terms of driving that efficiency. So we wait eagerly to see what these plans are.
Now, Mr. Sarakinsky, one of the issues that have come up regarding state-owned enterprises is the role of the owner here, who would still remain government. What role would government play then in these state-owned enterprises that are now being run like businesses?
Well, that's the crux of the matter. So the current situation is that SOEs report to the shareholder representative, which is a relevant minister. And that creates all kinds of corporate governance challenges in terms of political influence peddling, because politics is at the heart of the governance of the SOE. So if they are going to address this problem, it means that the shareholding is state-owned, but the reporting structure has to change. And you either make a statutory independent body that reports to Parliament or Portfolio Committee, but you keep the political head out of the governance structure of the process. And there are various models of corporate governance which enable that. And the Chinese have gone exactly for that, technocratic governance in terms of driving efficiency. And hopefully we will depoliticize SOEs by keeping the political head out of the governance of this new body.
Considering the reality of South African politics, and we are seeing a lot of that playing out in the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, just how much influence politics actually has in the world of business, how implementable is that for South Africa? How can that be a real reality for us?
In terms of a new model for SOEs, yes, it's implementable through an act of legislation, which then becomes binding. So you have a special SOE Act, and you restructure the functioning and the reporting lines of SOEs in accordance with that act, and you've transformed the organizational structure of the SOE in simple terms, and that can be very positive. And if it's to depoliticize, make it technocratic, and allow market discipline to come in, you may well insulate SOEs from the abuse, the malfeasance, and the corruption that we've seen.
There is a common perception, and I don't know whether this is accurate or not, but this common perception is that state-owned enterprises are ineffective and inefficient. What are your comments on that?
It depends what one means by inefficient. Because they provide services that communities rely on, not on a profit basis. So one has to be careful here. They can perform an incredibly important developmental role in putting infrastructure and services in place to communities who otherwise would be excluded because of non-profitability of that enterprise. And rail services to isolated towns is a good example of that. So if you can drive efficiency in management, you then have some slack to pursue a development agenda in terms of projects and initiatives that are less profit producing, but contribute to a broader development outcome in terms of agricultural produce to market, etc. And there are many examples of that.
I mean, our state-owned enterprises are at different stages of efficiency. Some problems that they share are common, while others are not. Are there any of the SOEs that, from your view, you believe should be discarded?
There should be a downsizing and a trimming of SOEs. In terms of what value they add to South Africa in terms of a developmental outcome. So some of the state-owned smaller airlines, even SAA, which is just not going to make a profit, could be privatized or sold off. But others are much more important, especially in terms of transport infrastructure, resuscitating Transnet and PRASA in terms of providing cheap transport, especially to poor people who don't have vehicles and rely on public transport. There you can have a significant development dividend just by driving efficiencies and making the organizational functional through market discipline and keeping politics out of the management and the planning of these SOEs. There are a number of other SOEs that have got pretty good track records over a long period of time. The Industrial Development Corporation is one. They don't rely on government bailouts since the 1950s. They have to live off their balance sheet. And that's a good example of how market discipline can drive efficiency and a major contribution to South Africa's economic development.
Talk to us, Mr. Sarakinsky, about the importance of having strong state-owned enterprises and how they feed back into the country, the fiscus, as well as both, political and economic objectives of a country.
So the country needs infrastructure, whether it's water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, not the production of electricity, but the infrastructure, transport infrastructure, road infrastructure. And often the private sector chooses not to invest in those kinds of projects because the capital outlay is very, very high. And it's high risk in terms of diversifying your asset base, in terms of many banks and many private sector companies that provide finance for these projects. So you need SOEs to come in and take the risk to provide this infrastructure in terms of transport, electricity, water, etc. the way forward might even be in terms of partnerships with the private sector, in terms of joint shareholdings, in order to drive efficiency in some way. And that's why I'm eagerly awaiting the statements from this panel that the president spoke about in the State of the Nation address. I really want to see the detail of what's proposed, because there are some positives that could be achieved if the proposals go in the right direction.
Mr. Sarakinsky, we'll leave it at that for this evening. Thank you so much for your insight as well as your time. That's Mr. Ivor Sarakinsky from the School of Governance at Wits University, discussing what the president spoke about yesterday, a centralized state-owned enterprises model that will ensure that state-owned enterprises are transformed, that they become efficient. And you heard what Mr. Sarakinsky was speaking about there. One of the key issues and one of the main problems with state-owned enterprises at times tends to be political interference. And when you then commercialize them, or you make sure that they're run as businesses and as enterprises, political interference will have to step aside in this regard.